Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me for Faith Informed, a Kingdom Conversation. My name is Mario Odighizuwa, and I'll be your presenter for this workshop or this breakout session. Today we're presenting for Multnomah University, the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wineskins, for their mental health conference, Building Bridges, Not Walls. I'm excited because I was told about this some time ago and invited by Dr. Paul Metzger, so a big thank you to him and his team. Today we're going to talk about mental health and the faith community. The presentation was originally presented at Peerpocalypse in 2019, which is the state's peer leadership conference. It's a conference put on by peers for peers, so folks who identify with having lived experience in mental health or addictions recovery. I am a peer, so my diagnostic history includes psychosis NOS, schizoaffective disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis, bipolar disorder, and I'm sure that will change since mental health is a changing experience for many of us. So I do identify as a peer, but I also identify as a peer of faith since I am a Christian. I am a believer in Jesus Christ. That is the faith tradition that I ascribe to. So one of the things that I wanted to see done in the peer or the recovery community is for people to be aware of the needs and sensitivities of peers of faith, regardless of what faith they come from. I found that there were a lot of folks that just weren't aware. So I created a presentation to build awareness for peer-delivered service providers and different providers and also peers. So today's presentation is going to be modified to focus on addressing the church. So the subtitle for this one is A Kingdom Conversation. We'll talk about four main things: the faith-informed definition, what it means and what it doesn't mean. Perceptions, what are some perceptions, negative and positive ones, that the church or the faith community oftentimes has of people with mental health issues. And then walking by faith or walking by sight, that general topic. I'll address some issues that come into conflict with that. And then the last thing will be service delivery, engagement approaches for peers of faith. So that'll be more practical things that you can do, that you can literally, after this presentation, you can start doing today. All right, so that's what we have for you today, and we'll get started. All right, so the first segment is on faith informed, what the definition is. So the definition, or I should say the goal of the workshop, the original goal was an attempt to encourage peers and peer-delivered service providers to be more aware of the needs and sensitivities of peers of faith. So folks like myself, anyone who's a peer of faith who identifies as a peer of faith, you want to be aware of those needs and sensitivities if they get admitted to a psych ward, if they're receiving outpatient mental health services, maybe they're going to an outpatient recovery center, a rehab center. If they identify as a peer of faith, oftentimes people have completely disregarded that. Some people do that under this notion of separation of church and state. But in the process of disregarding that, you end up offending the peer of faith, potentially causing more problems to them or for them, causing a degree of moral injury to that peer. So that's a part of why I created this workshop. So what does it mean to be faith informed? I'm going to tell you what it means and what it does not mean. So what it does mean is being aware of the needs and sensitivities of peers of faith. That's the first thing. The second thing is being aware of your own religious-related traumas or bias, and it could be both. Oftentimes you might encounter peers, might encounter providers, psychiatrists, different wraparound service providers that have no real regard for a patient's faith when it comes to their service, when it comes to them providing service. They may not be aware that they're actually hindering, harming, or making worse a person's condition because they're disregarding their faith. So, or because they have their own religious-related traumas, which creates a bias. So that's also why this was created. So what it does mean, like I said, is being aware of the needs and sensitivities of peers of faith, and then also being aware of your own religious-related traumas or bias. What it does not mean, faith informed, what it does not mean is being a person of faith, being or becoming religious, or evangelizing, proselytizing, preaching, or converting. So being faith informed doesn't have anything to do with those features that I just described. So it does not mean that you have to be a person of faith. You can be an atheist and still be faith informed. You don't have to become religious to be faith informed. You don't have to evangelize, proselytize, preach, or convert to be faith informed. It's just being aware of the needs and sensitivities that peers of faith have, but also being aware of your own bias. So what is a peer of faith? I do want to give that definition as well. What it does mean is a peer with lived experience in mental health and or addictions recovery who actively practices in a faith tradition of some kind. So that's like myself. I grew up with a missionary Baptist tradition, went to an A&B church. I now declare myself non-denominational, although when you hear me talk or when I answer questions related to my faith tradition, you'll see that I more so answer things in accordance to the Baptist faith tradition. But I do declare myself as non-denominational at this stage. So that is what a peer of faith is. Someone who has lived experience with mental health or addictions recovery, but is also active in their faith tradition. And active in their faith practice or their faith tradition is self-defined. All right, and so what it does not mean, what a peer of faith does not mean is someone who was baptized or saved. That's like a traditional term used in the Judeo-Christian community. And it does not mean that it's a peer who identifies as the dominant culture, faith, tradition. So that's also important to make sure that you don't make assumptions about peers of faith that, oh, well, they probably are Christian because the majority of folks in this area are Christian, or they're probably Muslim because the majority of these individuals come from this community. So we want to make sure that we don't make those kinds of assumptions. So I want to make sure I give you that first and foremost, that definition of what it means to be faith informed. And as I shared before, I'm going to say this a few times in this presentation that the original goal of this presentation was to inform peer providers, peer delivered service providers, and peers. So folks who deal with people who have mental health issues or addictions issues, to be aware of the fact that there's peers of faith out there and that they should address them appropriately. So that's the first segment. All right, so a couple quick quiz questions now that I've given you that definition. Question: which of the following is the best meaning for the term faith informed? Is it A, being a person of faith who is aware of the needs and sensitivities of peers of faith? Or is it B, being aware of the needs and sensitivities of peers of faith while being aware of your own religious related traumas and or bias? Or is it C, being religious while being aware of your own religious related traumas and or bias? Or is it D, converting peers into peers of faith? All right, you can put your answer choice in the chat box. And we'll see which of you have the right answer. The answer to that one is B, being aware of the needs and sensitivities of peers of faith while being aware of your own religious related traumas and or bias. It sounds like a mouthful, but that is the answer, B. All right, next question. Being faith informed, this is a true or false question, I should say. True or false? Being faith informed does not mean that a person must be or become religious. True or false? All right, you can put your answer choice in the chat box. We'll see which of you have it right. All right, the answer is true. The answer is true. All right, you do not have to be or become religious. All right, what about this question? What is the meaning of the term peer of faith? A peer with lived experience in mental health and or addictions who actively practices in a faith tradition, that's A. Or is it B, a peer with lived experience in substance use addictions who actively practices in a religion? Or is it C, a peer with lived experience who was baptized and actively practices mindfulness? Or is it D, a peer with lived experience who identifies as the dominant culture faith tradition? All right, go ahead and put your answer choices in the chat box. We'll see which of you have it right. And the answer is A. A peer with lived experience in mental health and or addictions who actively practices in a faith tradition. All right. All right. So this segment is on perceptions. So there's negative perceptions and there's positive perceptions. On your screen there should be a list of a few. I'm going to start off with some of the negative perceptions and then talk a little bit about a couple of them, and then some of the positive, and then I'll have some questions at the end for you. So, negative perceptions. The first one says people are passed off as acting out to get attention. And these are particular perceptions from the faith community, which includes the church. So people are oftentimes passed off as, so they're just acting out to get attention. You might see another one there that says people are seen as being demon possessed. Some say that, you're just angry with God. Folks who have mental health issues or addictions issues, you're just angry with God. Another one is you've done something wrong to bring this on yourself. How many of you heard that before? A lot of us have heard that before. Or your parents did something wrong to bring this on yourself. So I want to stop and talk a little bit about each of these because, again, this was originally done for peer-delivered service providers. So psychiatrists, counselors, peer support specialists, peer wellness specialists, certified recovery mentors. This was originally done for that audience. So there's some information that I share with that audience that I do want to share with you all today. There was the point there on bullet number 2 where it says people are often seen as demon possessed. So that's a true, that is something that's allowable within the faith community. That's something that you're allowed to believe in certain dispensations or certain denominations. So I had shared with folks at Peerpocalypse that there were schools across the country and across the world that teach courses in demonology, which investigate spiritual reasons for behavioral abnormalities within individuals or families. And I had also shared that there were over 500 priests that had arrived to Rome. This was about 4 to 6 years ago. It was reported on Mater Dei Radio, which is a radio station based here in Oregon. That over 500 priests had arrived to Rome to study demonology and other courses in order to become licensed to perform exorcisms. And this was recent. This is not like old history. This was within the last 4 to 6 years that they were reporting this. They had said that there was increasing numbers of family members who were requesting for priests to perform exorcisms within Rome. And so that's why lots of priests were going to get trained. And so this is a real thing. For folks in the recovery community, maybe psychiatrists, maybe counselors, maybe even peers themselves, some folks those individuals that I just mentioned, they'll probably roll their eyes or they'll be shocked. When I shared this information during the conference, they were shocked to hear that this was a real thing. For folks in the faith community, it may not be a shock because we're familiar with hearing demon language. We're familiar with hearing the term demon. So it's not a strange thing to hear that in the faith community. But it is important to know that that is a perception that folks in the faith community do have. Another one was angry with God. I had mentioned at the conference that oftentimes if a person is considered angry with God, they're considered to being close to being in rebellion with Him, with God. You might think back to your own experience with the emotion of anger. There may have been more times, more than likely, times where you wanted to do something that you would make the other person, or that you wanted to do something that would make the other person unhappy, make another person unhappy, whether by your own words or your own actions. Well, or maybe you were angry with someone you looked up to, who seemingly let you down. So being angry with God can sometimes be a projection of our own anger towards other people, family members. So it's not something that's too far-fetched for the faith community, but within the mental health or the recovery community, that might be a problem. People might be offended or turned off by that. So that is a perception that the faith community does have. The other one there on bullet point number 4, it says you've done something wrong to bring this on yourself. So this is a straightforward question. How many of you, when you do something wrong, you feel bad and you wonder whether you'll get in trouble for it or not? That's just generally speaking. How many of you might experience anxiety when you don't tell anyone what you did? Maybe you did something wrong, you didn't tell anyone, but you started experiencing anxiety because of that. Or I should say, when you experience anxiety, are you nervous? Are you shaking? Are you nauseous, sweating? The reason why I'm asking this is because the physiologic profile of any person who holds something in, namely a confession, will experience one or more of those kinds of symptoms, and that's regardless of faith. Even atheists experience that. So that's pretty universal. And that's why peers of faith may say you did something wrong or you need to confess something. For those of you that are watching this for the mental health conference for New Wine, New Wineskins, you all are probably more likely familiar with it. Well, the recovery community that I presented this to are not. Many of them are not familiar with that. So that's also important to know, that that's a perception that the faith community may have of folks who have mental health issues or addictions issues, but also be aware of the gap that a lot of folks aren't aware of that. All right, the next one was your parents did something wrong. All right, that's another one that's listed as a perception. That might come from within the church, from the concept around the sins of the father, the sins of the father concept, so predestination. I think I mentioned Ezekiel 18, chapter 20 at the conference, the one who sins shall die. I wrote the child will not share in the guilt of the parents, nor the parents share in the guilt of the child. And so I'm saying this because in that particular passage, the sins of the father is it's countered, it's done away with. So the sins of the father, I think, goes back into Chronicles, if I'm not mistaken, further back in the Old Testament. Well, in Ezekiel, and there may be a couple of the passages where that's actually reversed, or it's no longer the case. That has a lot to do with God's mercy, and that's what we believe in the faith community, or in the Judeo-Christian community. Another part that I had shared was that those previous words, those were words of Ezekiel. So no one sinned. This is another quote I'm giving. No one sinned, but this would happen for the glory of God. So those are words of Jesus, and that can be found in the New Testament. So this statement speaks to ancestors, family bloodlines, and how things that they do affect us to this day. And so I'm giving that information to you all because I shared that again with the Peer Apocalypse community. I'm kind of going back and forth between what I shared with them, but also wanting to make sure you all are aware as well. Let's see. God is punishing you. That's another big one. The concept of God punishing human beings is a consistent belief across the board, across the spectrum of religions. This notion is dismissed by both believers and unbelievers alike. The dismissal could be likely caused in part to missionary or evangelistic arm of the church to explain the concept of grace, a concept that is now relatively commonplace to the degree that people operate under it without them even knowing it or knowing its origin. So I'm just touching on a couple of those negative perceptions that are there, and usually negative perceptions from members of the faith community that are often expressed to people. It's typically to people who project a degree of suffering due to their mental health conditions or their mental health challenges. So keep that in mind. The negative perceptions from the faith community are usually expressed about people who project a degree of suffering. So like myself, I definitely projected a degree of suffering, and still do in some cases, because of my mental health challenges. So these are some perceptions that folks within the church or the faith community may have of me, because I project a degree of suffering when I explain or express myself. All right, so those were negative perceptions. There's a couple more bullet points there. One that says that's just old Uncle Junebug, and then it says in parentheses, simply who someone is. A lot of times the faith community or the church will pass people off as just being who they are, not recognizing the pathology that there is. So we'll see the pathology, or we'll see the illness as who they are, not an illness. Oh, that's just Uncle June, or oh, that's just Grandma so and so. Not realizing that that's schizophrenia, and over there that's PTSD. We'll just call it who the person is. So that's something that the faith community oftentimes does to folks that have mental health issues. Another one is the result of an unbalanced life. So some people may see a person who has mental health issues or addictions. Oh, their life is unbalanced. Their life is unbalanced. That typically can come from certain kinds of faiths or certain kinds of religions. When folks say that it's an unbalanced life. The next one says you did something bad in your past life. That's for those who believe in past lives. So again, these are negative perceptions that come from the faith community as a whole, even though I'm speaking to you all that are at the Multnomah University New Wineskins presentation. Be aware that these are negative perceptions that come broadly from the faith community as a whole. And then the last one says purgatory. You're in a place of suffering, a transitional place of suffering of some kind. And in that place, you suffer until you're delivered or until you're relieved. That may come from Catholicism or other kinds of faiths within the other kinds of faith traditions, I should say, within the Judeo-Christian spectrum. So I do want to backtrack a little bit and touch on those two comments that I made. Your parents did something wrong, and the scripture references that I gave, because I'm not a minister, I'm not a pastor, I am not clergy. I don't represent clergy. I am a peer of faith, so I've tried to gather as much information as I can, as best as I can, and as accurately as I could to present and share with you all. So that reference I gave, Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 20, that speaks to the perception that I mentioned earlier, the whole thing around your parent doing something wrong. In that particular passage, it says, the one who sins shall die. The child will not share in the guilt of the parents, nor the parents share in the guilt of the child. So that actually is where an individual takes ownership for their own sins, rather than it being the sins of the father, so something is passed down. But the words of Jesus changes that, and I had shared that earlier, where he says, no one sinned, but this would happen for the glory of God. I think I said all this a little bit fast earlier, so I wanted to make sure I come back and clarify it. So those are the words of Jesus when parents came to him wanting their son or their child to be delivered because their child was throwing themselves, if I remember correctly, into the fire or into flames, or there was some kind of challenge, and the parents wanted help. So the question that they posed to Jesus was, who sinned? Or that onlookers, I'll say onlookers, posed to Jesus was, who sinned, the mother or the father? Because that's how issues were resolved prior to Jesus' time. During that time, it was mainly figuring out who sinned. Was it the mom? Was it the dad? Was it the mother bloodline? Was it the father bloodline? And that's how we appropriate responsibility or blame. But Jesus was essentially, from my perspective, saying, that's not the focus. We're not focusing on who's to blame. We're going to focus on the fact that God is going to get the glory out of it, rather than focusing on who's to blame. And I guess I want to highlight this because blame is a very interesting topic or concept for folks in the mental health community or the recovery community, for peers like myself. There is a lot of talk about making amends. You might hear that on like the 12 steps in recovery, AA, CA, the different kinds of anonymous groups that are out there. But believe it or not, it seems to be one of the most ignored steps, or least invested steps, the notion of amends, forgiveness, and reconciliation. And that's because of the notion of blame. The National Institute of Mental Health has said that no one is to blame for mental health issues, for recovery, for addictions. No one is to blame, that it is a physiologic, it is a biological, it is something that a person did not do to themselves. They were born a certain way with certain biology. But the challenge or the conflict comes where they also are sharing. Again, this is the National Institute of Mental Health. They're also sharing the percentages of where conditions may lie or rest, where it may have come from. And I'm sharing this because I've shared this before in different groups, information that I've been given by different mental health agencies or advocacy groups. A lot of information comes from the National Institute of Mental Health, and I'm sharing my own experience here. They've given me information that talks about how no one is to blame, but they also give me information on statistics and data that shows where the blame lies, what percentage of it comes from, what are the chances, I should say, what are the chances of a person getting schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, anxiety disorder, or eating disorder, and where it comes from. Is it from the mom, from the dad, cousins? There's a lot of information that I've been given that I've shared before, but there's times where I feel like it may be in conflict. So I'm just sharing that with you for those of you that are with us at this conference now with Malone University. All right, so that should cover some of the negative perceptions. Now we're going to talk about positive perceptions. So on your screen you should see a few positive perceptions listed. The first one says divinely inspired. Again, these are perceptions from the faith community, which includes the church. You might also see touched. You know, we oftentimes might use the word touched. Someone is touched. Anointed is another one that we might use. These are towards people who have mental health or addictions issues, who might display a certain kind of behavior, and I'm going to touch on some of those behaviors. So divinely inspired, touched, anointed, blessed is another term that we oftentimes use, or chosen. Chosen is another term that we sometimes might use. So those are positive perceptions. So these are perspectives that are expressed to peers of faith who do not express a degree of suffering. And I guess this is from what I've observed. This is from what I've seen. So these are positive perceptions that we, the church or the kingdom, may have of people who have mental health issues or behavioral health issues or addictions issues. So these are expressed to peers of faith who usually don't express a degree of suffering, but they express a degree of enlightenment. And this may be as a result of their mental health challenges. And in such cases, they're not really challenges, but they're empowerments. So that's what I've shared with folks. Typically, that's usually what I share with folks in this workshop. That these are the terms or the perceptions that are oftentimes used towards people who have mental health issues by folks from the faith community, by the faith community. So we might say that they're divinely inspired, touched, anointed, blessed, or chosen. And this is important to note because the language that we use to describe folks may be offensive to one and may not be offensive to everyone. But it's important to note the different kind of language that we might use. We have reasons for why we use certain language, obviously. Being a Christian, having a biblical narrative, understanding the faith, we have a language set that we use within the kingdom, and it sets us apart and identifies who we are. Even within the individual denominations, we also have a language set. Pentecostals might speak differently from Baptists. Baptists might speak differently from Catholics. Catholics might speak differently from... So there's different language sets or dialects within the faith community that we use. So I just only listed like 4 or 5 perceptions that are oftentimes, or I should say commonly heard by the faith community when they're speaking about people in the mental health community or about folks who have addictions or recovery issues. So be aware of that. I have a couple of questions that I want to ask, like quiz questions. I have 4 of them that I'm going to ask, and you can answer these in the chat box. Based on the information that I just shared. Of course, this is on perceptions. So this is the first question. This is a case scenario. So Jason is a 23-year-old Caucasian male with a history of bipolar disorder. He shared with his brother that he sometimes hears voices and worries that his mental health is declining. His brother says in response to him, God is punishing you, and that is why you hear voices. Both Jason and his brother attend the same place of worship. Jason is likely being perceived as a peer of faith who may be experiencing a degree of, and there's a few answer choices for. So is it A, enlightenment, B, endowment, C, suffering, or D, sabotage? So the question is, Jason is likely being perceived as a peer of faith who may be experiencing a degree of which one of those? Is it A, enlightenment, B, endowment, C, suffering, or D, sabotage? And you just answer them as best as you can based on the information that I just shared and presented. All right, put your answer choice in the chat box. So the answer is C, suffering. C, suffering. All right, so that would be a negative perception. That means Jason's brother has had a negative perception of him, and so he might see him as suffering. That's why he said God is punishing you. All right, so the next question. The faith community may at times perceive mental health in a negative way. Examples of negative perceptions include, all right, so there's 4 choices. Is it A, a belief that a peer is experiencing an unbalanced life? B, a belief that a peer is demon-possessed? Or is it C, a belief that a peer is divinely inspired? Or is it A and B? So that's the D choice. Is it A and B? So again, examples of negative perceptions include, and you have to choose one of these. Is it A, a belief that a peer is experiencing an unbalanced life? B, a belief that a peer is demon-possessed? C, a belief that a peer is divinely inspired? Or is it D, A and B? All right, put your answer in the chat box. And the answer is D. It is A and B. So a belief that a peer is experiencing an unbalanced life, or a peer is demon-possessed. So we talked about the negative perceptions earlier, so that's the answer for that question. The next question is, the faith community may at times perceive mental health in a positive way. Examples of positive perceptions include, is it A, a belief that a peer is angry with God? B, a belief that a peer is in purgatory? C, a belief that a peer is divinely inspired? Or D, none of the above? Alright, so the question again was, the faith community may at times perceive mental health in a positive way. Examples of positive perceptions include, alright, you had 4 choices. Is it A, a belief that a peer is angry with God? B, a belief that a peer is in purgatory? C, a belief that a peer is divinely inspired? Or D, none of the above? Alright, put your answer choice in the chat box. The answer is C, a belief that a peer is divinely inspired. Remember, it asks for positive perceptions. Positive perceptions. Alright, so one more question, and then we'll move on. Alright, this is a scenario. So Kathy is a 19-year-old female with a history of schizophrenia. And she tends to share with her faith congregation certain messages that she is given from God. During a worship service, Kathy shared with the pastor's wife that she heard God tell her that her church is going to be given a large sum of money to help with their ministry efforts. In response to this information, the pastor's wife says, "Thank you, Kathy. You are truly touched by God." Alright, so Kathy has been sharing this message with various members of the church over the course of about 13 years. Alright, so she's been sharing this message with the church for 13 years. Which of the following perceptions is the pastor's wife likely having of Kathy? Is it A, enlightenment, B, endowment, C, suffering, or D, sabotage? Alright, go ahead and put your answer choices in the chat box. And the answer to this one is enlightenment. Enlightenment. Alright, that keyword touched is what gave it away. So that was one of the positive perceptions that I spoke about earlier. Alright, that keyword touched when The pastor's wife said, "Oh, you're truly touched by God." All right. I just wanted to highlight some of the negative perceptions and some of the positive perceptions that come from the faith community. I also want to add here that I don't want folks in the church to feel offended by the fact that these are the terms or these are the ways that peers are receiving this information. It's their experience. Like, I'm a peer. I'm a person with a mental health issue. There's times when I've been called or labeled different things that I've listed here. Even though I'm also a member of the church, a member of the kingdom, there's times when I have been offended by some of those things. But then a part of me is able to understand why, because I come from the church, I'm a part of the kingdom, so I understand that language. I think it's just important to be aware how our language and how we perceive folks with mental health issues can impact the person who's experiencing it. It might make them feel worse. It might make them feel more ostracized. It might draw them more closer to you. It might make them more dependent upon you rather than the faith itself or the deity, in this case, God, in case Jesus Christ. So that's also important to be aware of the impact of having positive and negative perceptions and how you perceive folks who have mental health issues. All right, this is the third segment, walk by faith or sight. Walk by faith or sight. So I found this significant because of my own experience. I'll just stop and share here. Within my own experience, I have been found on the freeway twice because of my mental health condition. Twice in a way that was unsafe, but it was also as a result of my belief or what I believed while in what's called a psychotic break or in psychosis. It was definitely unsafe. I won't go too much into details behind it. But some people say, oh, you were just walking by faith. That it was okay. You were expressing your faith. Well, being on the freeway in a manner that I was not safe. It was not okay. And I'll try to explain a little bit more about why it was not okay and how do I measure to what degree was it a faith expression versus psychosis. And I'm only going to be able to speak from my own lived experience. Again, I'm not clergy, I'm not a minister, I'm not a pastor, and I'm not I'm a qualified mental health associate, but I'm not a licensed provider like a psychiatrist or a counselor or a therapist. I'm a peer with lived experience, which is what grants me the qualified mental health associate credential from the state. So walk by faith or sight. On that, on your screen, you should have a couple things. The first thing says faith, and then there should be a second bullet point that says sight. The first one, I explained to the recovery community that walking by faith as a type of sight is something that's important to note. A lot of folks, obviously the church understands what it means to walk by faith and not by sight, but the recovery community or for the average lay person, they oftentimes don't. So I had to explain that during the Peer Apocalypse workshop or to peer providers and psychiatrists. I explained further that walking by faith is sight in many faith traditions. So walking by faith is sight. It's a type of sight, and for many people in the faith community, it is sight. So rather than walking by the natural eye, walking by faith is how you're supposed to live and walk, period. I've recently been saying, okay, yes, we walk by faith and not by sight, because that is biblical, that is a scripture that we live off of. But I've recently been adding, okay, walk by faith, but not by sight. But we walk by sight when our faith isn't right. That's what I've added. And that's something that I would say the Holy Spirit gave me. We walk by sight when our faith isn't right. And so that speaks to a person who has mental health issues, a person who has an evolving or a developing mental health crisis, while also being a peer of faith. So we walk by faith and not by sight. That's scripture. But I've learned that I have to walk by sight when my faith or how I perceive my faith isn't right. And I'll touch on that in the next segment a little bit. Well, let me read further. So I wrote, this is done so, walking by faith, that is done so by using a different type of technology rather than evidence-based. Every time in the recovery community, when I go to groups or presentations and trainings, they talk about evidence-based, peer-reviewed, which is very different from the faith community, which is different from what I've grown up hearing and learning about in the church or in the kingdom. So walking by sight and not by faith is considered blindness, spiritual blindness. That's what I've been taught in the church. That's what I've been taught in the kingdom. Whereas in the recovery community, people want the evidence. People want the tangible, concrete things, which is by sight, in order to live by. So that was a bit of a conflict for me. Under sight, I wrote, making a deliberate choice to only use concrete, evidence-based, quantifiable, or measurable approaches to life that are verified objectively can leave a person without a sense of agency. So for me, especially a peer of faith, I should say, it can leave a peer of faith without a sense of agency. So for me, because I'm a peer of faith, but I also have a mental health challenge, I felt that my faith was declining every time I was given evidence-based, quantifiable, measurable approaches to life as a way of recovery. So that's also important to know in the faith community as faith leaders, that depending on how we approach a peer of faith, it can affect their faith. And for me, being in the recovery community, participating in groups, being exposed to psychiatrists, psychologists, actually challenged my faith in a way that I started seeing it quantifiably going down. I started having less faith at times. So I didn't oftentimes like that. So it actually would make me engage less in treatment. But thankfully, I give credit to the Holy Spirit since I'm a Christian and I believe in the Trinity. I give full credit to the Holy Spirit for calming me down and revealing His truth to me while being a participant in the recovery community, while receiving treatment, while taking meds, while going to therapy, while being in groups. So I was able to stay in that environment, even though it was uncomfortable, even though I felt like my faith was going down. I stayed in there long enough to where the Holy Spirit took over, and I felt like my faith was regained in a way that, my faith was regained or increasing over the course of time. And so I was able to remain in that community and get the help that I needed, even when I was not fully engrossed in the church. I wrote, the self is no more not feeling, and this is under sight. So again, this is under following concrete, evidence-based, quantifiable things. Eventually, God or the deity is no more, particularly since the deity is believed to exist in another dimension. So if you're following a lot of evidence-based, quantifiable, measurable approaches to life and recovery as a person with mental health issues or addictions issues, you may find that the need for God is no longer. You don't need God. You've got the data. You've got the double-blind randomized research trial that shows the evidence. Just follow the research and you'll be fine. That's what a lot of folks do outside of the church, outside of the faith community. But for a peer of faith, it can be twofold. And so that's a part of why I have this segment here, walk by faith or sight. Well, I shared that I was on the freeway twice. Clearly, even though in that moment I spoke and talked about being in my faith, walking by faith, it was unsafe. And I have some metrics that I've listed under the next segment that I'll talk about, that kind of give you an idea of, is it okay? Is it right? Is this something that this person experiences along with the congregation, the corporate body that they're a part of? Is it a cultural thing? So there's a few different metrics that I've listed there, and this is going to be helpful for service delivery. That's what the next one is about. So reading on, it says, walking by faith is oftentimes encouraged amongst peers of faith. So that's like folks like me. It's oftentimes encouraged by clergy and religious leaders across the spectrum of faith traditions, which many of you know that are watching this video with Mulholland University. I shared this statement with peers and peer providers because many of them are unaware that walking by faith is encouraged by clergy and religious leaders across the faith spectrum, or across the spectrum of faith traditions. That can present as a problem. For example, with counselors, therapists, psychiatrists, they oftentimes get worried about connecting with faith leaders when they're trying to co-case manage a patient, because they're worried that it's going to cause more problems, or they may not find that it's effective or helpful in their treatment plan for the patient. So that's important to note. We know that walking by faith is encouraged by clergy members, but does it cause more problems for a person who has mental health issues or addiction issues? It might, if it's not being monitored or closely watched. All right. So that's that part of walk by faith or walking by sight. I'm now going to touch on the service delivery in the next bullet point. Before we go on to that service delivery bullet point, I'm going to add a couple pieces to this walk by faith or sight. When it is dangerous, and this is a bit controversial because I can list some examples of whether you would argue, well, it benefited us today, so it couldn't have been too dangerous for this person during that time. So when is it dangerous to walk by faith as a person who has mental health issues? I listed a few things under this faith-informed presentation. Safety to self and others, when that is compromised, it can be dangerous. When there's resistance to medications, that can be dangerous as well. A lot of peers of faith resist medications because they don't feel like there's a connection between the medications and their faith narrative. So if there is no connection, they're not going to participate. If they don't see God connected to the medication, they're not interested. They have the full right to not be interested because their faith narrative allows them that right. So how do you talk to a person who has mental health issues, is a member of the faith community, and may not want to receive those medications? That's a whole nother conversation, a whole nother workshop. All I want to express to you all in this workshop is that there may be some resistance to meds, and the reason why is because they may not see a connection between the medications and their faith narrative. And that was something for me at the beginning where it was difficult. So safety being compromised to the self or to others, that's when walking by faith can be dangerous. Another one is when the civil law has been broken. When civil law has been broken, which is very controversial. But let me just go on. So if someone is arrested or convicted, maybe persecution for their faith expression. This is a little difficult one. It's a very difficult one because there's many times where many faith leaders, clergy members have been arrested, and they were doing a lot because of their faith. Their faith told them to do certain things. Did it cause harm to self or others? Did they break civil law? These are just basic questions that you do want to ask or think about when you're trying to determine whether walking by faith is dangerous or not. That's basically what I wanted to list here. I also listed that, I think I wrote persecution of faith expression, so you should have that on your screen. So persecution for faith expression. Sometimes a peer of faith may feel that they're being persecuted because they're expressing their faith. When expressing their faith might be a psychotic episode. It may be psychosis. That's not for a clergy member to determine. That's more for a medical provider to determine. But that's important to note. Peers of faith may be aware of their first constitutional amendment, their right to free speech and religion. And that may be something that they're challenged with, like, why are they trying to make me take meds? Why are they coming against me? Why are they locking me up in a psych ward? Why are they making me go to the outpatient clinic to receive treatment? I have a right to my faith expression. In the medical community, some mental health issues might be considered religiosity, whereas in the faith community, it's faith expression. So there's some challenges there. We can go all day into that, but I'm just noting that so that you all are aware of it. Another perception is being captive in enemy territory. Some peers may feel who have mental health issues and are also peers of faith, they may feel that they're being captive or being held captive in some kind of enemy territory. We have plenty within the biblical narrative that talks about the children of God being held captive in enemy territory. So peers of faith who have mental health or addictions issues might identify with that narrative, and it might play out in their life or in their mental health. So be aware of that. Another time where it might be dangerous is where a peer of faith might reenact a life experience of a historical figure from holy text of some kind. In this case, we're talking about the biblical narrative, but it could be any holy text. And they may claim that they are the historical figure themselves. So maybe they're claiming that they can walk on water, or they're claiming jihad, or they're deputizing someone as a ruler or a king. I have a few questions that I can go into and give some examples. So there's different presentations that I've seen some peers demonstrate, that you may have heard of, some peers demonstrate, but they're also part of a faith community. So how do we determine the difference, and how do we approach folks like that? Another time when it might be dangerous is with suicidal or homicidal tendencies. In the case of the biblical narrative, specifically, I'm going to give a reference to Romans chapter 12, where believers are encouraged to be living sacrifices, not dead ones. That's important because within the Judeo-Christian faith tradition, being a living sacrifice does not call us to have to die. And that's important because there's some peers who may have mental health issues where they do believe they have to die. An example is off of 122nd and Stark, not too far from here. This happened just a few years ago. A young kid his name is Kelton Kennedy, this was in the news. He had mental health history. He also has some faith background, some faith tradition background. He was found climbing up a telephone pole, reaching for a live wire, and just before he touched the wire and passed away, he said, "I'm just trying to get closer to God." The street was completely blocked off, and police tried to help him and approach him, but it was too late. He passed away. So that falls under suicidal or homicidal tendencies. So that speaks to when it becomes dangerous, when walking by faith can become dangerous. Different clergy members, different faith leaders are all going to agree to different what's considered dangerous, what's not. But for me, and from what I've learned from my experience, which is why I've built the faith-informed presentation, I've concluded that suicidal or homicidal tendencies, period, are considered dangerous, regardless of faith tradition. That's what I've agreed to. That's what I've listed. Anger is when it can also be dangerous. That's more so rooted in Matthew chapter 5, verse 23. I'll talk a little bit about that probably in the Q&A section. Anger is also when it can be dangerous. All right, so that is Walk by Faith or Walk by Sight. Now we can talk about service delivery, engagement approaches. All right, so service delivery and engagement approaches. So approaches to engagement for peers of faith. How do you engage us? How do you approach us? Those of us who have mental health issues or addictions issues. And just, I should note too, addictions falls under mental health, for those of you that may not know. That's important to note. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, which is the federal guard dog or watchdog for mental health and addictions for our country, places addictions as a medical issue. And so that's important. And they also have that identified as a mental health issue. And so it's not just, it's not something that typically stands alone. I think it used to, historically, it might have used to just been separate from mental health. Now it's seen as a mental health issue. So that's why I say mental health and addictions a lot. So how do you approach peers of faith? Meaning peers who have mental health or addictions recovery experience and are actively practicing in their faith tradition. So I have listed, and you should see it on your screen, service delivery approaches. These that are listed were originally for, as I shared, these were originally for psychiatrists, counselors, therapists. Again, it was to empower them so that they don't disregard peers of faith, so that they make sure that they honor the different needs and sensitivities that peers of faith have. So the first one says, check the facts. Who's your spiritual or your worship leader? Do you have one? What holy text do you read from? Finding that out can be helpful when you're dealing with a peer of faith who has a mental health issue. What type of ritualistic sacraments do you practice? Is it foot washing, baptism, burning of candles, incense, menorah? Like what do you do? Communion. Obviously, there's some core sacraments, or there's some core rituals that the body of Christ practices differently depending on the denomination or the dispensation. But there are some core things that we do practice. But that's a question that you can ask a peer of faith. What is the geographical place of worship? So I specifically wrote the term geographical. So that pulls a person into understanding that, okay, where is the location in the earth, in the city, in the community that you live in, where you worship. If you ask a peer who has a mental health issue, where do you worship? They might say Pleiades, a constellation out in the universe. But really, you need to know, like, what's the address of where they worship? Is there a mosque? Is there a temple, a synagogue where they worship? What is the geographical place of worship? So that term is specifically there. And then prayer, meditation, or recitations. Do you have any specific prayer, meditations, or recitations that you use? If so, what are they? There may be some telltale signs of what they're dealing with or what they're going through when you ask them that question. The next set says, include faith-informed questions on your assessment. So some of you that are in the audience might appreciate this. Those of you that are clergy, pastors, or bishops, these are oftentimes questions that are not always asked by medical providers or outpatient mental health providers. So these are questions that I said are considered faith-informed questions that I would really want to see asked more by providers of peers of faith. The first one says, do you have a spiritual leader that you see regularly? Key word is regularly. So that could be a pastor, imam, rabbi, practitioner. In this case, it will be someone of the Judeo-Christian faith tradition, since we're talking about mental health in a biblical context. The next one says, do you have a regular place of corporate worship that you attend? So this one is asking about them in the context of a body, of a group of worshipers. You may get someone who is admitted to the hospital or comes to an outpatient center. They're a peer of faith. How they practice their faith is important to note. Is it practiced the same way that the body practices, that they're a part of, that the body is a part of? That's something that a lot of providers didn't ask me. There were things that I would do that they would dismiss as, oh, that's just their religious practice, when it wasn't. It was psychosis. So they didn't ask, do you have a regular place of corporate worship that you attend? And the reason why they didn't ask that is because they didn't care. It's also not a big part of their required assessment under JCO. I think I'll touch on that also at some point. There's only specific things that they're required to ask under JCO, which is the Joint Commission on Accreditation for Healthcare Organizations. So there's only certain things that they're required to ask. Well, I think that should be expanded because it would help a lot of folks like myself to be more grounded and to stay connected to their body, to the body of worshipers or believers that they're a part of, and they actually might get better that way. So the next one says, have you spoken with your spiritual leader or your mentor? Why or why not? And yeah, that's important. That's another approach. The next one is, in what ways have other members of your place of worship practiced your faith the way you practice it? So the key piece is how a person is worshiping. Is it a part of the body worship? Or is it psychosis? Or is it a mental health decline? Is it a decline in their mental health? That's important to find that out. The next one is there a holy text that you prefer reading from? What is it called? So that first question is yes or no. Is there a holy text that you prefer reading from? Yes. What is it called? For me, it's the Holy Bible. So this oftentimes is a question that is never asked for folks who have mental health issues. That needs to be asked. And it's something that you all should be aware of. So the next one says, do you need a space where you can pray or meditate? I found this one to be interesting and very significant. The Department of Human Services here in Portland, Oregon actually has within the government buildings spaces that are dedicated for certain folks to pray or worship, or to pray, I should say. And I found that out from a previous job that I was on, that there are certain departments or divisions within the Department of Human Services that offer spaces. For example, there's different immigrants and refugees that do have specific times when they pray, when they bow, when they kneel, where there's dedicated spaces within the government offices that they do have where they do honor that. That may be something to ask a person because they might want a private space to pray or meditate. There's also airports that I found out that also have dedicated prayer and meditation rooms. The London Heathrow airport is one in particular that they do have one, and it's a multi-purpose room for multiple faiths. There's other airports that do as well. I'm pointing that out because that was something that a lot of providers, medical providers, did not seem to care that there needed to be a dedicated, consecrated space for prayer or meditation for peers like ourselves. It's oftentimes as something that's just dismissed. Or you can just go to your room, go to your patient room, or you can just go to this hallway over here and you'll be fine. It's not considered something that's important. Well, for a peer of faith, it can be important. It may be important. For me, I know it was, and I did need times and spaces where I could pray and meditate. So the next part is create a safe faith space. It says create a safe faith space. And the ways that you can do that is by posting up a faith-informed notice. That's something that I wanted to try to encourage providers, try to encourage businesses, mainly medical providers, to do. To put up a faith-informed notice in their cubicle or their office space. That way folks will know that, okay, you may not be a religious provider, you may not be a religious wraparound service provider, but you are faith-informed. You at least are aware of the needs and sensitivities of peers of faith, and you're aware of your own religious-related bias or traumas. So the next one was dedicate a space for prayer or meditation at your agency. I encouraged agencies to do that during the Peer Apocalypse presentation. Also, be mindful of language that may be offensive to peers of faith. I think in the presentation I talked about language that would be offensive, using the name of God in vain, using curse language. Might not be the best language for someone who already feels or believes they're cursed. The next one is read up on the peer's faith tradition or read up on their faith tradition after the initial assessment or prior to ongoing appointments. This is something that I encourage providers to do. Not every provider will, but it's something that I do encourage them to do as an approach to peers of faith. The next one says ask for permission to speak with their faith leader. I put ROI, release of information. That's probably the top thing that is never done by providers, medical providers, psychiatrists. There's never a release of information filled out for their pastor, for their imam, for their rabbi. I was admitted a few times. Never was my pastor consulted. Never was my pastor called. Never was my pastor given a release of information. I really would like to see that changed, quite frankly, even at the JCO level, to see that as something that's mandated as a part of the medical record, because that can actually help a patient like myself, a peer of faith, who has both mental health and a faith background, helping them getting better. The next one says, encourage them to include special requests, them meaning the patient, on their advanced directive for mental health. So each state has an advanced directive for mental health. Oregon has one, they're available online, where myself, like the peer, is able to fill out an advanced directive indicating the kinds of treatment that they would like to have and they would not like to have in the event that they have a mental health crisis and they're admitted to an inpatient psychiatric ward or an inpatient behavioral health unit of some kind. That's something that you can encourage peers of faith in the body of Christ to do. And that's before crisis. They have a right to be able to do that. And I do encourage clergymen or faith leaders, I do encourage you all to begin asking members of your congregation that have mental health issues or addiction issues. So peers of faith, that's the term that I use to identify them, to look at even an advanced directive for mental health. And that's something that's available in each state. It's online, it's free, they can fill it out, have it notarized, make copies, give it out to those who they want to have authorization for it. That way, if they're ever admitted to the hospital or they're ever taken in because of a mental health crisis, some of their rights will be honored when they're admitted, and the advanced directive is made available. One way that I've encouraged folks to have it always available is to scan it and email it to themselves. So that way, if they're ever admitted somewhere, if they have access to the internet, which most places do now, they can have access to their email and then pull up the advanced directive if they ever feel that their rights are being violated or certain rights are not being honored. That's important, that last bullet point. So the overall goal, I had told folks as a part of this faith-informed presentation, is to make awareness the goal. Make awareness the goal, not pushing or pulling someone into or out of a religion. And again, this presentation was ultimately to make aware peer-delivered service providers, medical providers, and other peers of the needs and sensitivities of peers of faith. So those who have an active practice of their faith tradition, but also are challenged with mental health issues or addictions issues. But I'm finding that this information is also important for the church and for the kingdom to be aware of these things. So that's service delivery, and that's the engagement approaches. All right, so that is Faith Informed, a Kingdom Conversation. I want to give a big thank you to Dr. Paul Mesker for inviting me to be a part of this conference. I know he and I have been talking about it for quite some time, so I'm thankful to be able to have shared with each of you both my lived experience and also a perspective, the faith-informed perspective on how to approach peers of faith. I also want to give a thank you to Elizabeth Grinko and Matt, the tech specialist, for assisting me in coordinating, going back and forth on emails. I really appreciate all your help. And also just to the Institute for Cultural Engagement as a whole, the New Wine, New Wineskins crew. Thank you to each and every one of you. I know may have worked with one or two of you in different capacities over the last year. So I appreciate you all as well. And also Millennium University. Now we'll go ahead and start the Q&A session where you have a chance to ask some questions, and I'll do my best to answer them while we have time.